During the Victorian era, death was much more familiar companion in their daily lives. Life expectancy in those days was very low. People lived to only about 42 years of age. Dying at a young age was common. 3 of every 20 babies died before their first birthday. Death stalked people on a daily basis. You could step on a rusty nail or cut yourself and be dead within a few days. This was a time when customs and practices relating to death were almost like an obsession. Their treatment of death and dying was followed by many rituals that expressed their grief and also to honor their recently departed loved ones. When a death occurs, the entire house stops and takes up deep mourning. Windows are closed, clocks are stopped, and all mirrors are covered. They would use crepe or veiling to cover the mirrors throughout the house to avoid trapping the spirits. Family photos were also turned face down throughout the house to prevent the deceased person's spirits from possessing relatives and also friends. The family would hang a wreath tied with black crepe or ribbon on the front door as a signal to the neighbors and visitors that a death had occurred. The bell knob would also be draped with black crepe and tied with ribbon. When the body was removed from the house, it was taken head first so that it would be unable to call others to follow it. The duty of preparing the body for burial was taken care of by friends of the family. The body would be washed, then dressed. Flowers would be strewn around the face and throughout the coffin. Friends of the family took over important duties, including greeting callers and arranging details like meals and seating guests at the funeral itself. The funeral service was usually held in the house of the bereaved. The family was expected to view the remains before guests arrived, which made it imperative that guests arrive on time and not early. They were also seated in a separate room, protecting any show of grief from the eyes of the guests. The funeral procession would vary based on the cost of the funeral. The first carriage in the procession would contain the clergyman and the pallbearers, 6, sometimes 8, who would carry the coffin. The next carriage would be the hearse, followed by the carriage of the nearest relatives, which would be followed by more distant relatives and friends. It was considered quite of a scandal if any of the rituals were broken. For the wealthy, the burial of a loved one was as much about being seen and doing things properly as it was about the process of grief and mourning. However, it was very different with the lower classes. Because the death rate was so high, many lower class families would plan ahead and save money to make sure the death of their children would be handled in an appropriate manner. Funerals were very costly, and it was important that the lower class families often went without necessities of life, just so they could pay for the funeral. It was ironic because they pretty much starved their children so that they could give them a proper burial. Another very real concern was due to the Anatomy Act, 1832, to combat body snatching. This law legalized the dissection of people who died in prison, asylum, or in the workhouses. Unless a relative came forward within 7 days of the inmate's death and was prepared to pay for a coffin plus a churchyard burial, the inmate's body could legitimately be sent to the teaching institution for dissection. This donation would be made in return for a price, and then the institution used the money for whatever means. Often the corrupt official would just pocket the money. There was a very high demand for cadavers. There was a great deal of corruption in the system, and this law made it much more likely that the lower class individuals without money for proper burial would land up on the dissection table, lending greater fears about the final fate of a loved one. Seances were common in the Victorian period, as well as wearing mourning clothes for months and keeping tokens of the dearly departed loved ones, such as hair. Things like death masks became popular. They were made of wax or plaster and made of a person's face following their death, often taken the cast directly off of the corpse. Hair wreaths were common, as was hair jewelry. In the early 1900s, hair jewelry could be purchased through Sears and Roebuck catalog, and hair jewelry was also a popular way to remember the dearly departed. I do remember that a lot of people used to save the hair when they cut their children's hair and then later made pictures or hair jewelry out of it. Death photography was also quite popular, with the live members of the family posing with the deceased. The photograph often appeared as though the dead person is sitting up and holding their loved one's hands, with their eyes open as though they were still alive. This I have seen also, not quite to this extent, but I will talk about it later. Table tipping and dowsing and spirit board were also a form of keeping in touch with their dearly departed loved ones. Now, getting back to the picture taking, I still know a lot of people take pictures right after someone has passed away. I'm not sure who used to do it in Mom's family, but my mother still takes pictures of any of her family that has passed away, including my dad. And I guess this kind of goes back to the Victorian era. Kind of creepy, but I do know one of my cousins does the same thing, and her mother used to do it also. Her mom and my mom are sisters. Don't ask me if I'm going to, because I don't know if I could, but we shall see.